two events are independent, and this is the English sense of the word too, independent, one doesn't depend on the other. If knowledge that the one event occurred does not affect the probability that the other occurs. And we're going to link this to the definition we just had about conditional probability and say, remember, conditional probability said the probability of A given B, that's the conditional probability of A given B, is what's the probability A will occur given that B has already occurred. Well, if events A and B are independent, notice what this definition says, then that means that knowledge that one occurs doesn't affect the other one happening. So mathematically, this means that for independent events, the probability that A given B is equal to the probability of A. Only if we have independent events. If we don't have independent events, you cannot say this. But what we're saying here is that what's the probability of event A happening given that B has already happened? Well, if A and B are independent, it doesn't really matter, that one happened. Then I can just shortcut that and say, I don't actually need that given B. So an example of this would be if event A is you making it to class on time, and event B is what you are planning to have for lunch that day. I don't know. Something like that, you would say those are independent, right? Again, assuming you have a morning class, let's say, you would say it doesn't really matter if I decide that after I go to this morning class, I'm going to go have, Chick-fil-A, or I'm going to have McDonald's, or I'm going to go have Subway, whatever it may be. Whatever I'm going to have for lunch doesn't change with whether I make it to class on time. Those are independent. And so you'd say the probability that I make it to class on time given my decision for lunch is just the same as, well, what was the probability I was going to make it to class on time? It's useless information. Okay. However, if I were to say that event A is you making it to class on time, and event B is if the power goes out where you're staying, or if there's storms where you're staying, then you would say those are dependent events, because you would argue that the power goes out, maybe your alarm doesn't go off, maybe your phone doesn't charge and it dies in the middle of the night, your alarm doesn't go off, you don't make it to class on time. Notice that dependent events doesn't mean that one causes the other, it just means it affects the other, right? That's this keyword here, affects, right? Independent means one event does not affect the other. Dependent means it affects it. Doesn't mean it will change it. It just means it changes the odds, right? If you, if the power goes out where you live, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be late to class. It just means your odds are hampered, right? It just means that if I can guarantee that the power is on where you're sleeping the night before class, then the probability you make it to class on time is 95%, 99%, whatever it may be, because your alarm can go off and you're a functioning adult and you can get dressed and you can make it to class on time. That doesn't mean that you will, right? There may be traffic, or there may be, you may get an emergency phone call on the way. Who knows, right? Anything can happen. It just means that you have a certain probability of making it to class on time. But if the power goes out, it just means that your odds are less. You still may wake up at the same time, and it may not change much, but it might affect it, right? And this is important because we're going to talk about the difference between sampling with replacement and without replacement. We're going to use this in chapter 4b. And so we're setting this up to talk about sampling with replacement means that members of the population are replaced after being selected, and that each member can be chosen more than once. And so is this independent or dependent? In this case, I would say it's independent sampling, because by putting the person back in the population to draw from, whatever happens on the first pick doesn't affect what happens on the second pick. And we're going to contrast that with sampling without replacement, which means you don't put someone back. And now that's going to be dependent sampling, because whatever you happen to get on the first one then changes the odds of what happens on the next one. Think of it like this. If we go back to my power example, this isn't to say we know if the power is going out or not. It's just saying if the power stays on, your odds of making it to class are helped. And if it goes off, your odds are hurt. And that's the concept that we're talking about here, is that we don't know what we're going to get on the first pick in this sampling with or without replacement. We're just saying that if you sample without replacement, it just means whatever happens on the first one, good, bad, indifferent, doesn't matter, whatever happens, changes what's happening next because a different set of people are now left in the pool. But when we do sampling with replacement, it doesn't matter what happens on the first one because that person gets put right back and we're starting off, back on the same foot on pick two. And then the last part of this is mutually exclusive events. Mutually exclusive events cannot occur at the same time, meaning that they share no common outcomes. So if two events, A and B, cannot both happen at the same time, intuitively, just from an English standpoint, I would say that A and B cannot happen at the same time. And we talked earlier about probability, that if something is impossible, it has probability 0. So I'm going to say that the probability that A and B both happen is 0 if the events are mutually exclusive, because they cannot occur at the same time. Remember, we said anything that's impossible is probability 0. So probability of A and B equals 0 if my events are mutually exclusive. Then another term for mutually exclusive is disjoint. If you watch other videos, you may see that there's another word for it. I will use the term mutually exclusive, but disjoint is synonymous. Nothing wrong with using that.